So, in the year 2024, I would further expand my Grave Spotlight series by covering a number of different graves from not only within the Commonwealth of Virginia, but outside of Virginia, particularly those graves of the famous Siamese Twins who were buried down in Mount Airy, North Carolina. I would also include this person right here. This is George Washington Barkell, who was a secession conventioner for the state of Florida and would become a captain for one of the Florida regiments, specifically the 2nd Florida, and eventually passed away when he was killed at the Battle of Gates Mill. I would also cover a number of other graves, particularly those from over at Hollywood Cemetery, just further down the road, and here in Chaco Hill Cemetery, as well as my tried and true Oakwood Cemetery, which is one that I love to cover a lot. So, you go ahead and enjoy these lovely shorts that I've made, and I will see you again in 2025.
This is the grave of Matthew Fontaine Maury. He was born on January 14, 1806 in Spotsylvania County, Virginia. He'd go on to enlist with the United States Navy, eventually becoming the superintendent of the U.S. Naval Observatory, where he would write a number of books on ocean currents and meteorology. It was his works on ocean currents that would make him the father of oceanography and would earn him international acclaim. When the American Civil War broke out, he would join the Confederacy and would act as a diplomat in Europe until the end of the war. He spent his final years at VMI before passing away on February 1, 1873, at the age of 67. If you wish to visit his grave, he is buried in President's Circle at Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond, Virginia. This is the grave of Mr. Mort O'Sullivan, who died on October 7, 1825, at the age of 44. Unfortunately, his headstone had suffered serious damage over the years due to a combination of weathering and some form of physical damage. This headstone is made out of red sandstone, a sedimentary rock which is prone to suffering flaking damage, especially when exposed to water. Headstones made out of sedimentary rocks, such as sandstone and slate, were commonplace in colonial America and in the early history of the United States. However, due to its inherently fragile nature and lack of prestige, using sandstone and slate for headstones would fall out of favor in favor of marble and granite headstones.
This is the grave of Captain James Keith Boswell, who was born November 18, 1838 in Fauquier County, Virginia. He would enlist with the Army of Northern Virginia and become a part of Thomas J. Stonewall Jackson's staff throughout much of the war. However, on May 2, 1863, during the Battle of Chancellorsville, he, along with Stonewall Jackson, were riding ahead of the main contingent of their army, and in a terrible incident, he was mistaken as a part of a Union cavalry detachment that was trying to attack the Confederates, which led to the 18th North Carolina to fire at them. James Keith Boswell was killed instantly during the fire, while Thomas J. Stonewall Jackson was wounded during the friendly fire incident. If you wish to pay your respects, he is buried here in the Confederate section here in Fredericksburg, Virginia, specifically the Confederate Cemetery.
This is the grave of Private John Nelson. Born in 1837, likely in Hamilton County, Florida, he would enlist with the Company I of the 2nd Florida Infantry on June 14, 1861. In July 1861, the 2nd Florida would be transferred to Northern Virginia to be incorporated in the Confederate Army of the Potomac, which would later be called the Army of Northern Virginia. However, before he would see combat, John likely fell ill and was hospitalized in Richmond, passing away on August 29, 1861. He was 24 years old at the time of his death. He would be the first known burial in the Confederate section at Oakwood Cemetery in Richmond, Virginia, being buried in Section A, Row A, Grave 1, nearby the entrance of the cemetery. This is the grave of Private Jackson Kent. Born in 1840, likely in Hamilton County, Florida, he would enlist with the Company I of the 2nd Florida Infantry on July 13, 1861. The regiment would be transferred to Northern Virginia shortly thereafter. However, he would end up passing away on August 29, 1861, from an unknown complication. He would be buried next to Private John Nelson, who died on the same day, and be the second person buried in Oakwood Cemetery after it had been opened up for military burials. If you wish to visit his grave, he is buried in Section A, Row A, Grave 2 of Oakwood Cemetery's Confederate section in Richmond, Virginia. This is the grave of Private Riley Green. Born in 1839, likely in Hamilton County, Florida, he would enlist with the 2nd Florida Infantry, Company I, on July 13, 1862. The 2nd Florida would eventually be transferred to Virginia, but he would fall ill and be hospitalized in Richmond during this time. He would pass away on September 1st, 1861, at the age of 22. If you wish to visit his grave, he is buried in Oakwood Cemetery's Confederate section in Section A, Row A, Grave 3, adjacent to 2 other members of Company I of the 2nd Florida Infantry. This is the grave of Private William J. Powell. Born in 1836, likely in Jackson County, Florida, he would enlist with the Company F of the 2nd Florida Infantry on May 10, 1861. The 2nd Florida would be transferred to Northern Virginia, but before they would see combat, Powell would be reported as absent while he was being treated at Warwick Hospital in Richmond, Virginia. He would pass away on September 4, 1861, at the age of 25. If you wish to visit his grave, he is buried in Oakwood Cemetery's Confederate section in Section A, Row A, Grave 4, alongside 3 other members of the 2nd Florida Infantry. This is the grave of B.W. Layton. Born in 1836, likely in Spartansburg County, South Carolina, he enlisted with the Company D of the 3rd South Carolina Infantry on April 14, 1861. He and his regiment would be transferred northward to the Confederate Army of the Potomac by June of 1861, being assigned to Bonham's brigade. He was last recorded on the muster rolls on June 30th, 1861, but it is likely he saw action during the Battle of First Manassas. However, he would end up dying several months later. His exact date of death is unknown, but he likely died in early September of 1861, at the age of 25. If you wish to visit his grave, he is buried in Section A, Row A, Grave 5 of Oakwood Cemetery's Confederate section. This is the grave of Private William Harris. He was born in 1839, likely in Washington County, North Carolina. He would enlist in Washington County on June 25, 1861, as a part of Company G of the 1st North Carolina. The regiment would be transferred to Northern Virginia between July and August of 1861. However, he would become sick shortly thereafter and be hospitalized in Richmond, Virginia, where, in September of 1861, he would pass away at the age of 22. If you wish to visit his grave, he is buried in Oakwood Cemetery's Confederate section in Section A, Row A, Grave 8. This is the grave of Private Thomas M. Hogan. The information concerning his date of birth and where he was born is largely lost to us, but we do know he was at least above the age of 18 in 1861, as he enlisted with the Company L of the 2nd Florida Infantry on July 13, 1861. The regiment would be transferred to the Confederate Army of the Potomac, which would later become the Army of Northern Virginia, but before they would see combat, Hogan would end up being hospitalized and would pass away on September 9, 1861. If you wish to visit his grave, he is buried in Oakwood Cemetery's Confederate section in Section A, Row A, Grave 9. This is the grave of Private Thomas Davis. He was born between 1841 and 1842, likely in or nearby Abbeville County, South Carolina. At the age of 19, he would enlist with Company B of the 7th South Carolina Infantry on April 15, 1861. The regiment was transferred to the Confederate Army of the Potomac and fought in one engagement during the First Manassas Campaign. However, according to the muster rolls, he contracted typhoid fever and would die in Richmond on September 11, 1861. If you wish to visit his grave, he is buried in Oakwood Cemetery's Confederate section in Section A, Row A, Grave 10. This is the grave of Private Daniel V. Bagwell. Though his birth date is unknown, we know that he enlisted with the Company D of the 13th Alabama in Montgomery, Alabama on July 18, 1861. By late July, the 13th Alabama, including Bagwell, were transferred to Virginia, specifically to the Army of the Peninsula, which would later be incorporated into the Army of Northern Virginia. However, Bagwell would end up dying on September 13th, 1861, and would be buried shortly thereafter. If you wish to visit his grave, he is buried in Oakwood Cemetery's Confederate section in Section A, Row A, Grave 10. This is the grave of Private William Barry Huddleston, Jr. Born in Pike County, Georgia in 1825, he would move west to Randolph County, Alabama, with his wife and children sometime before the war. With the outbreak of the war, he would enlist with the Company B of the 13th Alabama on July 19, 1861. He, along with his regiment, were transferred to Virginia in the summer of 1861. However, before the regiment would see much action, Private Huddleston would contract a disease, passing away on November 9, 1861. If you wish to visit his grave, he is buried in Oakwood Cemetery's Confederate section in Section A, Row A, Grave 11, adjacent to Private Daniel V. Bagwell of Company D of the 13th Alabama. This is the grave of Private James Sills. Born sometime between 1836 and 1838 in Georgia, he and his family would move to Florida prior to the American Civil War. With the outbreak of the war, Sills would enlist with Company I of the 2nd Florida Infantry on July 13, 1861. He, along with the rest of the regiment, would be transferred to the Army of the Potomac, which would later become the Army of Northern Virginia. However, before he would see action, he would end up passing away, likely from disease, on September 16, 1861. If you wish to visit his grave, he is buried in Oakwood Cemetery's Confederate section in Section A, Row A, Grave 13.
We're here at the William L. Smith plot at Oakwood Cemetery to talk about two individuals that are mentioned on this large headstone over here. Now, the William L. Smith plot is owned by William L. Smith, who died in 1910 at the age of 70 years old. He is buried here with his wife, Lucy T. Smith. Now, one of the people that is mentioned on this headstone is his brother, Robert R. Smith, who died on May 16, 1864, at the Battle of Drury's Bluff, otherwise known as the Battle of Proctor's Creek. He was a corporal of Company A of the 15th Virginia Infantry. However, his headstone also mentions his stepbrother, John R. Bradley, who was also killed at Drury's Bluff on May 16, 1864, and was a lieutenant of Company A of the 15th Virginia Infantry. Now, his stepbrother is not buried here at this spot. In fact, he is buried in Shockoe Hill Cemetery.
This is the grave of Private William Woodbury Turner. Born in 1842 in Virginia, he would enlist with Company D of the 1st Virginia Infantry Regiment in 1861. He would serve throughout the war, but would be wounded during the Battle of Proctor's Creek, also known as the Battle of Drury's Bluff, on the morning of May 16, 1864. He would survive his wounding, serving at Major General George E. Pickett's headquarters until the end of the war. He would remain single throughout his life, until his death in 1885 at the age of 43. If you wish to visit his grave, he is buried with his parents in Shockoe Hill Cemetery in the Alston D. Turner plot. This is the grave of James W. Loving and his wife, Sarah P. Loving. Born in 1822, James Loving would eventually marry the much younger Sarah after his wife passed away in the 1870s. James would pass away on November 24, 1884, leaving his younger wife widowed. She would eventually pass away on September 17, 1920, and be buried next to her husband. Originally buried on a parcel of property they had owned, their property would be abandoned for many decades. However, in the 2010s, the Memorial Regional Medical Hospital acquired the property, and by 2021, a medical office was built next to their final resting place. If you wish to visit their grave, they are buried in their own plot directly across the street from Shady Grove United Methodist Church in Hanover County, Virginia. This is the grave of Private Henry Brown. Born in 1833, he would enlist with Company A of the 59th Alabama in 1863, which would be assigned under Brigadier General Archibald Gracie III's brigade. He was likely wounded during the Battle of Proctor's Creek on May 16, 1864, and would be transferred to one of Richmond's hospitals. He would pass away on June 9, 1864. His headstone erroneously claims that he died in 1862, which was likely due to the Battle of Proctor's Creek being labeled as the Battle of Drury's Bluff, the same name as the 1862 naval engagement, which happened almost exactly 2 years prior. If you wish to visit his grave, he is buried in Oakwood Cemetery's Confederate section in Section F, here in Richmond, Virginia. This is the grave of Private Cameron McCall. Born in Marlborough County, South Carolina on May 14, 1834, he would enlist with the Company K of the 8th South Carolina on April 13, 1861, one day after the firing on Fort Sumter. He, along with his regiment, would be transferred to the Confederate Army of the Potomac. However, before he would see any action, he would be hospitalized throughout the duration of the summer of 1861. He would eventually pass away on September 30th, 1861, at the age of 27. If you wish to visit his grave, he is buried in Oakwood Cemetery's Confederate section in Section A, Row A, Grave 45, in Richmond, Virginia. This is the grave of Private Jacob Shelby Clons. Born in 1820, he would marry Mary Elizabeth Bonner in 1840 and have at least 3 kids with her, settling down in Paulding County, Georgia, before the outbreak of the war. Upon the outbreak of the war, he would enlist with the Company D of the 7th Georgia Infantry, which was mustering in neighboring Cobb County. The regiment would soon be transferred to Virginia and be placed within the Confederate Army of the Potomac. However, as with many men of this time, he fell ill while his regiment fought at First Manassas, passing away on September 23, 1861, at the age of 41. If you wish to visit his grave, he is buried in Oakwood Cemetery's Confederate section in Section A, Row A, Grave 46, in Richmond, Virginia. Next to follow was William C. Bannister. Born on January 9, 1809, he had become an officer in the Exchange Bank in the city of Petersburg. In his advanced years, he had become increasingly deaf, though this didn't prevent him from hearing the alarm in the city. His family had begged him not to go, but he admonished them, telling them, "This is no time for anyone to stand back. Everyone that can shoulder a musket must fight. The enemy are now right upon us." He would assemble with Wolfe's company and fight. However, his deafness would prove to be his undoing. As the call for retreat was issued, he had not heard it, continuing to hold his ground as the Federals encircled his position. The Federals demanded his surrender, and, either not hearing the demand, or out of defiance, he continued to resist until a bullet found its mark in his head, killing him instantly. This is the grave of Private J. L. Giles. Though we don't know when he was born, we do know that he enlisted with the Company G of the 4th Texas on July 19, 1861, in Grimes County, Texas. The 4th Texas would be transported to Richmond and organized there. However, by that point, Private Giles had fallen ill. He was not alone either. Some 400 men out of the 1,181-man regiment had fallen ill by October of that year. Private Giles would eventually pass away on November 10, 1861, in one of Richmond's hospitals. If you wish to visit his grave, he is buried in Oakwood Cemetery's Confederate section in Section A, Row A, Grave 67, in Richmond, Virginia. This is the grave of Corporal John S. Wickett. Born in 1831, he would enlist with the Company D of the 18th Georgia Infantry Regiment on May 15, 1861, in Daugherty County, Georgia. He would enlist as a corporal and later be promoted to a color corporal, bearing the colors of the unit. However, after his regiment had been transferred to Virginia and remained active in the unit, he would fall gravely ill, suffering from chronic hepatitis. He would be treated at the Springfield Hospital, also known as General Hospital No. 26, until his death on October 29, 1861. If you wish to visit his grave, he is buried in Oakwood Cemetery's Confederate section in Section A, Row A, Grave 123, in Richmond, Virginia. This is the grave of Private Theophilus J. Dameron. He was born in 1836 in Brunswick County, Virginia. He worked as a farmer up until the onset of the war when he, along with many in Brunswick County, enlisted with Company I of the 20th Virginia Infantry Regiment. The regiment, led by then-Colonel John Pegram, would be placed under Garnett's brigade, but would subsequently surrender during the Battle of Rich Mountain. However, Private Dameron was not with the unit. He had been absent due to illness and was being treated in Richmond, but would ultimately pass away on September 16th, 1861, at the age of 25. If you wish to visit his grave, he is buried in Oakwood Cemetery's Confederate section in Section A, Row A, Grave 46, in Richmond, Virginia. This is the grave of George Wythe. Born on December 3rd, 1726, near Hampton, Virginia, he would become one of the most prolific lawyers in the colonies. He would take up a teaching role at the College of William and Mary, educating other prominent Virginians such as Thomas Jefferson, James Monroe, Henry Clay, and John Marshall. After writing against the tariffs instituted by Parliament and the outbreak of the American Revolution, he would be one of 17 Virginia delegates to sign the Declaration of Independence. After the war, he would participate in the Constitutional Convention and help ratify the United States Constitution for the state of Virginia. In 1806, his nephew, George Wythe Sweeney, poisoned him to acquire his inheritance. George Wythe would pass away on June 8, 1806, at the age of 79. If you wish to visit his grave, he is buried at St. John's Episcopal Church in Richmond, Virginia. This is the final resting place of Ching and Eng Bunker and their wives. Ching and Eng were both born on May 11, 1811, and Smut Sungram, Siam, as conjoined twins. This oddity would result in them being acquired by Scottish merchant Robert Hunter, where they would go on tour for decades. Their abnormality would result with others with this condition being called Siamese Twins. After decades on tour, they were able to gather enough wealth to finally settle down, setting up home west of Mount Airy, North Carolina. They married sisters Adeline and Sarah Ann Yates and had 21 kids, Cheng with 10 and Eng with 11. They would support the Confederacy during the American Civil War, losing much of their wealth. They'd go on tour one last time until their deaths on January 17, 1874, Cheng passing away first, with Eng passing away 3 hours later. If you wish to visit their graves, they are interred at the White Pines Independent Baptist Church, west of Mount Airy, North Carolina. This is the grave of Christopher Wren Bunker. Born on April 8, 1845, he was the son of Ching Bunker, one of the Siamese Twins. He would spend much of his childhood on his father and uncle's estate west of Mount Airy, North Carolina, going on tour with his father and uncle until the beginning of the American Civil War. During the war, he would enlist with the 37th Virginia Cavalry Battalion on April 1, 1863, fighting during the 1864 Valley Campaign until his capture near Moorefield on August 7, 1864. He would be taken to Camp Chase, where he would be held in deplorable conditions until his exchange on March 4, 1865. He would remain proud of his military service for the rest of his long life, finally passing away on April 2, 1932, 6 days shy of his 87th birthday. If you wish to visit his grave, he is buried nearby Antioch Baptist Church in Surry County, North Carolina. This is the grave of Stephen Decatur Bunker. Born in Surry County, North Carolina on April 12, 1846, he was the son of Eng Bunker, one of the Siamese Twins. Much like his older cousin, Christopher, he would go on tour with his father and uncle until the outbreak of the war. In 1864, after turning 18, Stephen would enlist with the 37th Virginia Cavalry Battalion and fight with his cousin during the Valley Campaign of 1864. He would avoid being captured at Moorefield, but would be wounded during the Third Battle of Winchester on September 19, 1864. He would survive the war and return back home west of Mount Airy, North Carolina, eventually passing away on March 25, 1920, at the age of 73. If you wish to visit his grave, he is buried in the White Plains Baptist Church Cemetery, just west of Mount Airy, North Carolina. This is the grave of Ralph R. Horn. Born on August 22, 1834, in King William County, Virginia, he would marry Mary Wade prior to the outbreak of the American Civil War. With the outbreak of hostilities, he would enlist as a private in Company I of the 15th Virginia Infantry. However, he would be marked as absent, as he was made a commissary sergeant, placing him in charge of the distribution of food rations. He would make it through the war, passing away on June 1, 1909, at the age of 74. If you wish to visit his grave, he is buried in the Walnut Grove Baptist Church Cemetery in Hanover County, Virginia. This is the grave of Robert Samuel Jeter. Born on August 6, 1845, he would enlist with the Company K of the 56th Virginia Infantry on March 3, 1864, at the age of 18. He was likely present during the Battle of Proctor's Creek, North Anna, Cold Harbor, and the duration of the Siege of Petersburg. In October, he would be issued fresh clothing, but beyond this point, the records of his service are lacking. However, he managed to survive the war, marry Louise Adeline Brooks, and have at least 4 children. He would pass away on September 7th, 1911, at the age of 66. If you wish to visit his grave, he is buried in the Walnut Grove Baptist Church Cemetery in Hanover County, Virginia. This is the grave of John K. Stark. Born on April 21st, 1834 in Hanover County, Virginia, he would marry Charlotte E. Hogan and have 2 children prior to the outbreak of the war. On May 9th, 1861, he would enlist as a private with Company G of the 4th Virginia Cavalry, then under the command of Captain Williams Carter Wickham. Throughout the duration of the war, he would be promoted up the ranks, reaching the rank of sergeant by 1865. He would be paroled on April 16, 1865, shortly after Lee's surrender on April 9th. He would return to Hanover County and have 4 more children before his death on April 2, 1891, just shy of his 57th birthday. If you wish to visit his grave, he is buried in the Walnut Grove Baptist Church Cemetery in Hanover County, Virginia. This is the grave of Reverend Joseph Stark. Born on December 21st, 1798 in Virginia, he was related to the Stark family of Hanover County, though his exact lineage to the family is complex. However, through his family connections, he ended up in possession of the Liberty Hall plantation in Hanover County and came to reside there in the latter years of his life. Prior to this, he lived in Henrico County with his wife, Martessa Stark, and would have a number of children, including John Kerr Stark. In his latter years, he would become the pastor of Walnut Grove Baptist Church prior to his death on July 25, 1853. He was originally buried at the Liberty Hall plantation, but his remains were eventually relocated to Walnut Grove Baptist Church in 1974, after the area was developed. If you wish to visit his grave, he is buried in the Walnut Grove Baptist Church Cemetery in Hanover County, Virginia. This is the grave of Sergeant George Henry Smith. Born on February 4th, 1837 in Middlesex County, Virginia, he would enlist in the Confederate Army on July 18th, 1861 at Urbana as a private. The unit he would enlist with would become Company C of the 55th Virginia Infantry Regiment. Over the course of the war, he would be promoted from private to sergeant, becoming a courier under General A.P. Hill's staff. He would be wounded at Chancellorsville and would end up absent a number of times due to illness. However, he would survive the war, eventually getting married twice over the course of his life before passing away on March 5, 1921, at the age of 84. If you wish to visit his grave, he is buried in the Walnut Grove Baptist Church Cemetery in Hanover County, Virginia. This is the grave of Private Oliver P. Miller. He was born in Greensburg, Westmoreland County, Pennsylvania, on March 5, 1842. He was still residing within the county upon the outbreak of the American Civil War and would go on to enlist with Company E of the 67th Pennsylvania Infantry Regiment on September 10, 1862. He, along with his regiment, would fight at 2nd Winchester, the Mine Run Campaign, the Overland Campaign, Sheridan's Shenandoah Campaign, and during the Siege of Petersburg. He would be discharged on June 20th, 1865, returning back to Pennsylvania. After the war, he'd marry his wife and eventually move down to Hanover County, Virginia. He would pass away on January 22nd, 1914, at the age of 71. If you wish to visit his grave, he is buried in the Walnut Grove Baptist Church Cemetery in Hanover County, Virginia. This is the grave of John W. Wright. He was born on June 12, 1837 in Hanover County, Virginia. Upon the outbreak of the American Civil War, he would enlist with the Company K of the 56th Virginia Infantry Regiment, which was under the command of Captain Dabney Carr Harrison. However, before he would see any action, he would be discharged due to a disability. During that summer, he suffered from partial paralysis in his left hand, likely due to a spider bite, which prevented him from performing his duties. However, this bit of misfortune proved to be fortuitous. The 56th Virginia Infantry Regiment would be captured in its entirety at Fort Donelson in Tennessee the following February. He would live out the rest of his days in Hanover County before passing away on February 13, 1878, at the age of 40. If you wish to visit his grave, he is buried in the Walnut Grove Baptist Church Cemetery in Hanover County, Virginia. This is the grave of Private David L. Grubbs. He was born in Hanover County, Virginia on June 9, 1845. Being too young at the beginning of the war, it would not be until 1864 that Grubbs would be conscripted into service, fighting with the 19th Virginia Heavy Artillery Battalion until the end of the war. Shortly thereafter, he ended up under the custody of the Provost Marshal of Hanover County, Captain Charles H. Stevens of the 67th Ohio Volunteers. He wrote in a letter about the allegations against Grubbs, proposing he work in a chain gang for 30 to 60 days. In spite of this rocky start, he would eventually get married, have many children, and pass away on June 28, 1905, at the age of 60. If you wish to visit his grave, he is buried in the Walnut Grove Baptist Church Cemetery in Hanover County, Virginia. This is the grave of Corporal William A. McGee. He was born in 1841 in Hanover County, Virginia. Upon the outbreak of the American Civil War, he would enlist with Company K of the 56th Virginia Infantry, Captain Harrison's company. He appears on the records in 1861, but there is a gap in 1862 before he once again appears on the records, likely due to him and the entirety of the 56th Virginia surrendering at Fort Donelson. However, his records remain intact throughout the rest of the war. He would survive the war and marry Hester Ann Tucker. However, she would pass away at a young age and William would not remarry. He would eventually pass away on May 1st, 1925. If you wish to visit his grave, he is buried in the Walnut Grove Baptist Church Cemetery in Hanover County, Virginia. This is the grave of Elizabeth Van Leeuw. Born on October 12, 1818 in Richmond, Virginia, she was the daughter of two northern parents who had moved south to the city. She would be educated up north, where she would begin developing strong abolitionist sentiments and pro-Union sympathies. Upon the outbreak of the American Civil War, she would become a spy within the city, relaying messages from POWs at Libby Hill and developing her own cipher. One of her most notable feats was the secret exhumation of Ulrich Dahlgren after he had been killed after Kilpatrick's controversial raid of Richmond had failed. After the war, she had become the postmaster for the city, eventually retiring from that position before passing away on September 25, 1900. If you wish to visit her grave, she is buried in Shockoe Hill Cemetery in Richmond, Virginia, underneath a unique headstone. This is the grave of George Washington Park Hill. He was born in Richmond, Virginia in 1822, but his parents moved south to Florida by the time he turned 5. His father, John, would found the Tuscaloosa Plantation in Leon County, Florida, just east of Tallahassee. After his father's passing in 1855, George would inherit the plantation and manage it until the secession crisis of 1860 began. He would serve as a representative for Leon County during Florida's secession convention and raised a company in Leon County. This company would become Company M of the 2nd Florida Infantry, with him acting as captain of the company. The regiment would be transferred to Virginia and engage in fierce fighting throughout the Peninsula Campaign. On June 27, 1862, he would be killed at Gaines Mill at the age of 40. His body servant would bring his remains into Richmond, where they would be laid to rest in Richmond's Shockoe Hill Cemetery, where they can still be found to this day. This is the grave of Dr. William Falshy. He was born on October 26, 1749 in Northumberland County, Virginia. Descended from French Huguenots who settled in Virginia in 1699, he would study medicine at the University of Edinburgh, and distinguish himself as a surgeon during the American War for Independence. In 1782, he would become the city of Richmond's first mayor. He would also serve in the House of Delegates, act as postmaster for the Commonwealth, and as president of the James River Navigation Company, where he succeeded another prominent Virginian, George Washington. He would regularly send correspondence to Thomas Jefferson until his death, passing away on August 21, 1824, at the age of 74. If you wish to visit his grave, he is buried in Shockoe Hill Cemetery in Richmond, Virginia. This is the former grave of Claudius Crozet. Born in Villefranche-sur-Saône on December 31, 1789, he was originally known as Claude Crozet. After his mother passed away, he moved to Paris to live with his father and would gain entry into the École Polytechnique in 1805. Upon graduation, he would become an artillerist in Napoleon's Grand Army, eventually reaching the rank of captain before his resignation in 1816. Shortly thereafter, he would move to the United States and become an educator at West Point. He would later serve as the principal engineer for the Virginia Department of Public Works, become the first president of the board of directors for VMI, and would act as the chief engineer of the Blue Ridge Railroad Company, where his unique tunnel design would be used on 4 distinct tunnels. He would pass away in Chesterfield County on January 29, 1864, and be laid to rest here in Richmond's Shockoe Hill Cemetery. However, his remains would be exhumed and later laid to rest at VMI in 1942. This is the grave of Private John W. Blunt. He was born in Hanover County, Virginia in 1825, but later moved to Richmond. He would be married twice and be widowed twice, having only one daughter survive to adulthood. In 1863, with the American Civil War still raging, he would enlist with the 1st Battalion Virginia Infantry, a local defense militia raised for the defense of the city. By 1864, Blunt and the rest of the unit would finally see action on March 1st, 1864, when Ulrich Dahlgren's detachment of cavalry would attempt to storm the city from the west. They would make a stand along 3-Chapter Road nearby the Green Farm and repulse the assault. But Blunt would be killed during the ensuing fight. He would be brought here to Shockoe Hill Cemetery and be laid to rest next to his wife's and infant child. This is the grave of Louise Owen Beatty and her husband, Henry Clay Beatty. The two had been recently wed in 1910 and had one child, but not all was well with the young couple. Henry had a long-term affair with a woman of the underworld, a young lady named Beulah Binford. Dissatisfied with his marriage, he had his cousin purchase a shotgun and, on July 18, 1911, murdered his wife along Midlothian Turnpike. Henry had developed a lie, saying she was shot by a highway robber, but the police located the shotgun used in the murder and traced it back to him. After a harrowing trial, one that would gain national notoriety, Henry Clay Beatty was found guilty and would be executed by the electric chair on November 24, 1911. Both would be buried in Maury Cemetery in Richmond, Virginia, a murderer lying next to his victim. This is the grave of Daniel Trueheart Sr. He was born on December 21, 1793, in Hanover County, Virginia. With the outbreak of the War of 1812, he would serve under the 2nd and 19th Virginia militia units, reaching the rank of lieutenant by the end of the war. After the war, he'd marry Elizabeth Seabrook, and would have 5 children with her before her untimely death in 1849. Eventually, he would pass away on October 11, 1861, at the age of 67, being laid to rest here in Shockoe Hill Cemetery in Richmond, Virginia. This is the grave of John Mercer Patton. He was born in Fredericksburg, Virginia on the 10th of August, 1797. After graduating from the medical department of the University of Pennsylvania, he would enter into law in Spotsylvania County. He would engage in politics as a Jacksonian Democrat, serving in the U.S. House of Representatives for the 11th and then eventually the 13th District from 1830 until 1838. When Virginia Governor Thomas Gilmer resigned in 1841, he would serve as the acting governor for 12 days until his term expired. He'd eventually pass away on October 29, 1858, and would be buried in Shockoe Hill Cemetery in Richmond, Virginia. However, he would leave a lasting legacy, being the great-grandfather of none other than General George S. Patton, Jr. This is the grave of Private William Stover Ashbrook. Born on March 16, 1894 in Richmond, Virginia, his father, Thomas Price Ashbrook, worked for the Southern Railroad. By his early 20s, he moved to Hopewell and worked as a gun, cotton munitions worker by 1917. However, with the U.S. entry into the First World War, he would be drafted and assigned to Company K of the 318th Infantry Regiment of the 80th Division. He would be sent to France on May 22, 1918, and would engage in the Meuse-Argonne offensive. On the first day of the second phase of the operation, October 4, 1918, Private William Stover Ashbrook would be killed in action. His remains would be returned to the U.S. and laid to rest here in Maury Cemetery in Richmond, Virginia. This is the grave of Henry Killing. He was born on December 26, 1794, in the city of Norfolk, Virginia. He would become a Baptist preacher, graduating from the Baptist Seminary in Philadelphia in 1821. He would settle down in Richmond and would engage in theological publications, including the short-lived Evangelical Inquirer magazine and the Baptist Preacher Monthly periodical. However, he would be most well known for his joint efforts in founding a seminary west of Richmond, which later became the University of Richmond. He would marry his wife, Jane, and have 2 children, though he would outlive his son. He would finally pass away on November 19th, 1870, at the age of 75, being laid to rest here at Shockoe Hill Cemetery in Richmond, Virginia. This is the grave of Captain Robert Henry Killing. Born in Richmond, Virginia in 1827, he was the son of Reverend Henry Killing, a well-known Baptist minister and founding member of the University of Richmond. Robert would attend the Virginia Military Institute and would fight in the Mexican-American War as a lieutenant. He'd eventually move to Alabama, where, upon the outbreak of the American Civil War, he would raise what would become Company F of the 12th Alabama Infantry Regiment. By late April of 1862, he would be elected to the position of captain, but would meet his untimely end at the Battle of Seven Pines on May 31st, 1862. He would be laid to rest in Shockoe Hill Cemetery in the city of his birth, deeply missed by all those who knew him. This is the grave of Johnson Jones Hooper. Born on June 9, 1815 in Wilmington, North Carolina, he'd moved to Alabama by the age of 20 and marry his wife, Mary, in 1842. It was during his time in Alabama that he'd write and publish a number of works, becoming a part of the up-and-coming humorist movement in the South. His most prominent work, Some Adventures of Captain Simon Suggs, would help inspire Mark Twain's works in the postbellum years. However, his writing career would come to an abrupt end with the secession crisis of 1860. He'd take a position as Secretary of the Provisional Confederate Government, moving from Mobile, Alabama to Richmond, Virginia. It was during this time that he would suffer from the effects of tuberculosis and pass away on June 17, 1862, at the age of 45. He would be laid to rest in Shockoe Hill Cemetery in Richmond, leaving his wife and 2 sons behind. This is the Confederate section within Hebrew Cemetery in Richmond, Virginia. This section came into use during the American Civil War. Many Jews would enlist with the Confederate Army, fight in the war, and would die on the field surrounding Richmond. The congregation Beth Ahabach, who managed the cemetery, decided to take the remains of these men and inter them within the Hebrew Cemetery. This includes men like M. Levi, who died on May 31, 1862 at Seven Pines. E.J. Sampson, who died June 27, 1862 at Gaines Mill. Captain Jacob A. Cohen, who died August 30, 1862 at Second Manassas, and Lieutenant William Wolfe, who died May 9, 1864 at Swift Creek. This cemetery is unique as it is one of only 2 Jewish war cemeteries in the United States of America. This is the grave of the Honorable William Izzard Clompton. He was born in Virginia on May 27, 1839, the son of Judge John Bacon Clompton. He'd take up his father's career as a lawyer, but this career would be disrupted by the outbreak of the American Civil War. On April 25, 1861, he enlisted with the Richmond Fayette Artillery, Company L of the 1st Virginia Artillery. He'd enter as a second lieutenant and, by the end of the war, achieve the rank of senior first lieutenant. After the war, he'd continue his career as a lawyer and, after a heated court case, became the judge of the Hustings Court in Manchester, Virginia. He'd marry twice, but have no kids, and would eventually pass away on July 25, 1909, at the age of 70. If you wish to visit his grave, he is buried here in Maury Cemetery in Richmond, Virginia. This is the grave of Private John Avery Kearsley. Born in Manchester, Virginia on June 11, 1835, he had worked as a laborer prior to the outbreak of the American Civil War. When Virginia seceded, Kearsley, as with the many men of the city of Manchester, would enlist with Company I of the 6th Virginia Infantry Regiment. He'd serve with the unit until, on September 25, 1864, he would be wounded, being shot in the left arm. He'd be treated at Chemerizo Hospital, where surgeons removed 3.5 inches of his left humerus. He'd be rendered disabled, and his time in the 6th Virginia was over. After the war, he'd end up marrying and have 3 daughters. He'd pass away on January 14th, 1877, and would be laid to rest here at Maury Cemetery in his home city, modern-day Southside Richmond. This is the grave of Captain Richard Augustine Willis. He was born in Tennessee on January 22nd, 1831, but later moved to Chesterfield County, Virginia. There he'd become a farmer, acquiring a large amount of farmland, large enough that a road leading to his holdings would be named after him, Willis Road. With the outbreak of the American Civil War, he'd become the captain of Company I of the 14th Virginia Infantry Regiment. However, upon reorganization of the 14th Virginia, he would be retired on May 5th, 1862. The war wouldn't escape him, however. His home would become a landmark during the Battle of Proctor's Creek on May 16th, 1864, situated in the middle of Beauregard's assault on the Union right. After the war, he'd retain his large property until his death on December 22nd, 1885. He'd be laid to rest here at Maury Cemetery in modern-day Southside Richmond, Virginia.